In today's video, you're going to learn everything you need to know about handling events within React. We're first going to talk about what an event is, and then we're going to talk about whether React events are the same as HTML events, as spoiler alert, they're actually not. And then, of course, we're going to talk about how do you actually handle events within React, and then also some kind of helpful things to know when handling events. So what is an event? Well, an event represents some action that the user takes. This might be something like a button click, or it might be something like a page navigation, or it could be something like the user swipes on the page, or the user submits a form, or they drag an element, something like that. And when these events occur, these events are going to be emitted, or these events are going to be fired. And these events are represented by just a plain old JavaScript object. So these events are literally going to look like an object, and it's going to have like a type property, and it's going to tell you the type of the event, and it will have a target property and tell you where on the web page that occurred, and so on and so forth. So an event represents some user action, and this event is just a JavaScript object that has some data in it representing the event. And when these events occur, you often want to capture that this event occurred. It's like, okay, the user clicks on a button. You want to do something after that button has been clicked to make your page nice and reactive. So that would be capturing that event. And then after you capture it, you usually want to perform some action. So if they click on submit for a form, the action that you're going to want to take is probably to submit that data to your database and then tell the user some success message like, hey, your form has been submitted. You're now going to be navigated to the homepage or something like that. That would be handling that submit event and then kind of directing the user where it might make sense to take them. So when a user takes an action, an event is emitted. That event is represented by a JavaScript object, and you often want to capture that event and perform some action. And that would be called handling the event. Now, HTML has a ton of different events that are going to be emitted, like on click and on drag over, so on and so forth. And in React, events are very similar, but they're not exactly the same. So what React actually uses is called a synthetic event. So kind of like a fake event. It's actually just a wrapper around the HTML native event. And the reason they use this wrapper is because it makes this event cross-browser compatible. So it's compatible across all browsers. And it will have a very similar user face to the native event, but like I said, it will work across browsers. Now, with React, there are some differences in the naming. So React events, those are going to be camel case. So instead of just lowercase on click, like it would be in HTML, in React, it's going to be lowercase on, and then it's going to be capital C, and then click. So in React, events are going to be camel case, as HTML in React is actually JSX, which is actually JavaScript, which JavaScript by convention is camel case. And then not only that, but there are differences in the naming of events within React compared to HTML. So for example, in the React docs, they mentioned that on mouse leave, this camel case event here, is an event in React, but in HTML, the equivalent event is actually just called a mouse out event. So this lowercase event, mouse out versus on mouse leave. Now, React in their docs has a list of the events they support. So if you're like, I'm trying to use this HTML event, and say that you used mouse out but just camel cased it, that's a reasonable place to start. But if that's not working like you expect, then I would go to the React docs and see, okay, what are their events? Or, a Google search is going to return you what the equivalent mouse out event is. Okay. So React events, they are very similar to HTML events, but React will wrap them in a synthetic event to make them cross-browser compatible. React events are going to be camel case, and with React events, not all of them are going to have the exact same name as the HTML event. Now, with all that being said, how do you actually move forth and handle events in React? Well, in HTML, you would do something called adding an event listener. You would have the element in which you expect the event to occur on, and then you would do .add event listener and pass in a callback function to run when that event occurs. And in React, that's not typically how you do it, not generally how you do it. And if you find yourself like querying the document to add event listeners and stuff like that, there's a chance that you're doing something wrong. Now, don't get me wrong. I think that there's probably those edge cases in which you might actually have to do something like this, but most of the time, you probably should stay away from using the add event listener API. And instead, you should just provide the event listener within the JSX that you are rendering out. So here, this is a running app that I have running right now. And as you can see, it is a super boring counter app in which I just have this count here and then a button to change the count. But this will allow me to give examples on how these event listeners work. So just this basic app here in which you can see that I have a count and then a button to change the count. And to handle this on-click event for the button, well, within my JSX here, I can just add an attribute to my JSX with the name of the event that I want to handle. So I want to handle the on-click event here. So I just put in as an attribute on-click in camel case, and then I can pass in my function here. And notice here that I pass in a reference to my function. I don't call the function here. So if I call the function, that would just, as soon as this renders, it's going to call the function. But I don't want to call this function as soon as this button renders to the page. I only want to call this function when this button is clicked. So if you just pass a reference to this function, then the HTML that's effectively going to be rendered here is going to know that, hey, we're only supposed to call this function when this button is clicked on. And then I add this handle change count. By convention, usually for event handlers, you might use the kind of terminology of handle and then whatever the event is. So handle change count, or you might also see on change count. Both of those are used quite a bit in professional applications. But automatically here, when this button is clicked, it's going to call this function. And when it calls this function, React is automatically going to pass this function an event. So as an argument to this function, React is going to pass it this synthetic event. And this event is going to represent what occurred on the page. So it's going to have a type, it's going to have the element that was clicked on, so on and so forth. So here in my handle change account, I'm going to console log my event. And then all I'm going to do is I have some state here that is my count. And if you haven't seen my video on state, it might be helpful to watch that to know what's going on here. But then I just increment my count by 1. So if I go back to here and I'm going to actually open up my console here so you can see what is emitted to the console when I click this button so we can see the event. But you see, when I click on this, it increments the counter. So I correctly handled this event. And then over here, this is where I console log the event. So me console logging this event is going to emit this to my console here. And you can see that this is a synthetic base event. This is React wrapping the native HTML event in this synthetic event here. And as you can see, it has like the type of the event was click, and then where it was located on the page is here. And then there also is a target here, which is my button element. So you can see that this event has a lot of different properties and values to allow you to handle the event. And especially with something like an input, well, you're often going to want to know what the value of that input is. So you might need to use the target element. And then if you access the target.value, that would give you the value of an input. Now, you won't always use that because in React, you might use something called controlled components, but I will have a video on uncontrolled and controlled components, and we will specifically talk about inputs in a little bit more depth. But for the sake of this video, you can see that when I click on this element here, it emits this event, and then I capture this event, and all I do is perform some action after this event takes place. In this instance, I just increment this count here. And you can see it emits this synthetic event. Now, like I said, notice that this is an on-click with the camel case and not just a all lowercase on-click there as well. So that kind of gives you a general understanding of handling events in React. But I do want to cover one other thing that that is particularly useful when handling events. And that is, what if you want to pass a argument to this function here? So here I'm just referencing the function here, and this event gets automatically passed to the argument. But what if I wanted to pass like more arguments to this function? Well, that is something that you will very commonly do within your React applications, and it is fairly straightforward once you kind of get used to how it looks. So here I have the very same app, except I just changed a few different things. So for one, my handle event function here is called handle change count, just like before, but now it expects 2 arguments, or it sets up these 2 parameters here in which I could pass 2 arguments to this function. And then one is called add or subtract. So depending on what's passed as an argument here, I'm going to determine whether I want to increment or decrement my count. And then here, I'm going to pass an argument called number, and that is how much I want to increment or decrement by. So I'm going to say if add or subtract is equal to add, then I'm going to set my count to current count plus my number. But if it's not add, I'm going to make sure to decrement my count here. And then I'm going to use my number to be what I increment or decrement by. Now, quick note, you probably wouldn't want to use a just like magic constant here. You'd probably want to have like some constant here called, I don't know, this is a very bad name, add or subtract. And with constants, it's generally consensus to use like all capital letters for them. But here I could do like add is equal to add, and subtract is equal to subtract. And then instead of just repeating this kind of magic constant everywhere, I could just do add or subtract dot add. And then I could do the same thing here. And this just prevents me from making a typo and kind of not knowing what's going on. So with that, now let's talk about actually passing these arguments to this function here. So in this onClick, what I actually decide to do here is I pass an inline function here. And then within my inline function, I then call my event handler function with these 2 arguments here. So I then call this handle change count with the first argument that is going to evaluate to add right here. And then the second argument, which is 4. So this should increment my counter by 4 when I call this. And notice here, it still passes the event into this inline function. So if I wanted to use the event in this function here, I definitely still could. And let's just go ahead and still console log the event here like we were normally doing. But now I need to make sure to pass it as an argument to this function here. So we're going to pass the event as the first argument. So to pass arguments to a event handler here, you actually will want to pass in an inline function. And then in that inline function, that's where you're going to receive the event. And if I want to use the event in my overall function handler here, then I need to then pass an argument of my event to this handler. And then I can also pass any other arguments as well. So if I didn't mess anything up and I run this here, you're going to see that when I click on the button, it increments my count by 4, and you can see it emits this event every time. And then if I come back here and let's say that I change this const to subtract, and then let's subtract by 2, we should see this now decrement by 2. And we do see that. So this is me handling this event. Now, one thing to note here is, like I mentioned earlier, I don't want to just pass this function like this, because what this is going to do is every time that this button renders, it's just going to call this function right away. So by passing this a inline function, it's only going to call this inline function here, because this inline function, I'm still just passing a function reference here. And I could, create a whole nother function, say handler, and then here I could create a function that then calls this handle change account, and I could just pass in this handler as a reference right here, and that would work the very same way. But often you'll see these passed as just an inline function. So here I just need to pass an inline function reference. And quick side note, I definitely spell things wrong all the time in my videos. So feel free to call me out on that. I tend to speak JavaScript and not English. But with this, you just pass an inline function here, and then you can call your handler with the arguments that you want. So for events in React, an event represents some action that the user takes. And this event is represented by just a JavaScript object. And when a user takes some action, this event gets emitted, and you often want to capture the event that was emitted and perform some action when the user takes an action. And in React, events aren't exactly the same as just basic HTML events. The events are going to be camel case, and React is going to wrap the HTML native event in a synthetic event to make it cross-browser compatible. And then there's also going to be some differences in naming conventions, like in React, it's going to be called onMouseLeave, and the equivalent HTML is mouse out, but you can consult the React docs for a list of the event handlers that they have. And then to handle events, you should probably, in most circumstances, stay away from add event listener, and you should just pass your event as a JSX attribute, and then pass in a reference to a function to be called when that event occurs. Don't call your function immediately when you pass your event like that. That's going to call your function every time this renders instead of just on click. And then automatically, React is going to pass a synthetic event to your function reference here. And if you want to use arguments for your function handler, then one of the most common things to do is pass an inline function, and React is then going to pass your event to that inline function, and then you can call your overall handler with arguments, as well as kind of passing the event along as well. And this doesn't have to be an inline function. You could create a separate outside function as well. But if you do need to use those arguments, you're going to have to pass pretty much two functions to this handler. So you can use some arguments here in which you're not forced to just call this function immediately every time that your element gets rendered. So hopefully that gives you a good idea on handling events in React. Stay tuned for more videos, and I will catch you in that next one.